My name is Casey Miller, and the night my family finally ran out of chances started with one sentence: no money, no party this year. My younger sister said it like she was already defeated. She talked about being behind on rent, about her hours getting cut, about maybe having to pack up and leave her place near campus. I believed her. I told her the party did not matter, that keeping a roof over her head did. Then I pulled from the little savings I keep for emergencies and put a month of rent into an envelope. That envelope went straight into my bag, waiting to be dropped off at her landlord's office. A few nights later, I was on the couch while my son stacked plastic blocks on the rug. I opened Facebook just to zone out for a second. The first thing on my feed stopped me cold. My sister's living room was washed in DJ lights. People were crowded around a catered buffet, and in the middle of it all stood a champagne tower. Clip after clip, photo after photo. Every angle was her place. The same walls I had been in days earlier when she said she was broke. My son glanced at the screen and frowned. Didn't she say there was no party this year? I did not answer. I walked to the hook by the door, took the rent envelope out of my bag, laid it on the table, and snapped a picture of it. Then I sent it to my sister with 2 words: return to sender. Less than an hour later, my phone lit up with call after call from my dad's number. If you have ever felt like the family wallet instead of family, stay with me until the end of this story, and tap follow so you do not miss how badly this all explodes. When the next morning settled in, a dull heaviness followed me around my apartment like a shadow I couldn't shake. I kept moving, loading breakfast dishes into the sink, answering Logan when he asked for more cereal, but my mind stayed locked on the glare of those party photos. There was something almost surreal about the contrast: her glittering night and the envelope sitting motionless on my table. I had stepped in because I believed her. I had stretched my own budget because I thought she was drowning, and the more I tried to push those images away, the sharper they cut. By mid-morning, I knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing had shifted. The weight of what I'd seen demanded clarity, even if I didn't want to face whatever that clarity would reveal about my younger sister, Kelsey Miller. Talking to her had always required a kind of emotional bracing, as if every conversation carried the risk of turning into a tangled set of excuses and guilt. But ignoring everything wasn't an option. That envelope, and everything behind it, was still in my hands. I slipped on a jacket, mostly to give myself something to do with my shaking hands, and sat at the edge of my bed. That was the first moment it hit me how easily trust inside a family can be chipped apart. One lie, one manipulation, one performance of helplessness. It all added up in ways that left a person questioning their own judgment. I hated that feeling, the sense that I had been played not by a stranger, but by someone who grew up under the same roof, ate at the same table, and once cried on the same nights I did. The hum of a notification broke the silence. I didn't look right away. I already knew who it was. My phone kept lighting up with her name, each buzz tightening something inside my chest. I wasn't ready to speak to her, not when my head was still replaying those flashing colored lights that filled her living room. What bothered me most wasn't the party itself. It was the ease with which she had spoken about hardship, how natural it seemed for her to lean on me without hesitation, and how casually she had celebrated behind my back. Later that afternoon, after Logan settled with his homework, I stepped outside for air. The crisp wind bit at my face, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Standing on the stairwell of my apartment building, I stared out at the row of student houses across the street. The same kind of houses Kelsey lived among. The same environment where parties like the one she hosted were practically currency. Maybe that alone should have warned me. Maybe I ignored every instinct because I kept wanting to believe she'd finally grown out of the chaos she carried with her everywhere she went. That thought stung more than anything else. I had given her the benefit of the doubt too many times, and each time I told myself it would be different. But nothing ever changed. Her crises always arrived neatly packaged, dramatic enough to pull attention, desperate enough to pull sympathy. And I always stepped in, partly because I loved her, partly because I didn't want to see her fail, and partly because I had been conditioned to believe that protecting her was somehow my responsibility. As I stared at the street below, another realization crept in quietly. The party wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something she had been pressured into. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice. She chose celebration over honesty, appearance over integrity, indulgence over stability. And she did it knowing exactly where her rent money had come from. My throat tightened with a mix of anger and something heavier. Grief, maybe. Grief for the version of her I kept hoping would show up someday. Grief for the idea that family meant the same thing to both of us. Grief for the years I had spent absorbing the fallout of her decisions, convincing myself I was helping when really I was enabling her to keep burning bridges she never tried to fix. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty space where the envelope had been. Removing it had felt like taking back a part of myself I had given away without thinking. There was no satisfaction in that, only a muted sense of reclaiming something that should have never been on the line in the first place. Logan's footsteps echoed down the hall as he went to fetch a snack, and I felt the faintest shift inside me, a reminder of what mattered, who mattered, and how fragile personal boundaries can be when you let guilt do the decision-making for you. This wasn't just about Kelsey anymore. It was about drawing a line I should have drawn long ago. And for the first time in days, the fog in my head cleared enough for a single, steady truth to take shape. It was time to protect my life from the chaos I kept excusing. By the time evening pressed itself against my windows, the silence in my apartment felt different. It wasn't calm. It held a tension I could almost feel on my skin, like the air before a storm breaks open. And then it started. My phone buzzing in short, clipped bursts, each vibration shaking the edge of the counter where it rested. I didn't need to look to know the name that kept flashing across the screen. I also didn't need to answer to understand that ignoring her would only push the pressure onto someone else in the family. That was always how it worked. I stepped away from the phone and began straightening the living room, moving objects that didn't need moving just to keep my hands occupied. The pattern of our family's behavior had become painfully predictable over the years. Whenever one of us stood up to Kelsey's chaos, someone else swooped in to smooth the edges, claiming it was for the sake of peace. But peace built on one person's exhaustion was never really peace. I had spent years learning that the hard way. Another round of buzzing filled the room, longer this time. I finally glanced down. Dad. The caller ID lit with his name, and something inside me unwound and tightened at the same time. My dad, Robert Miller, rarely called without purpose. His voice had always been a stabilizing force in my life, steady even when things around us spun out of control. But it was that steadiness that often made him the center of every family dispute, the one who tried to patch the holes no matter who tore them in the first place. I let the call go to voicemail. Not because I wanted to ignore him, but because I wasn't ready to hear the disappointment I feared would be in his voice. Not disappointment in what I'd done, but in the fact that the family was slipping into another fracture he couldn't glue back together. When the buzzing stopped, the apartment felt too quiet again. I leaned forward on the counter, palms pressed into the cool surface, trying to steady the swirl of thoughts running through my mind. I wasn't angry at him. I just didn't want to be pulled into another round of explanations, another attempt to justify why protecting myself wasn't cruelty. A few minutes passed before the phone lit up again, this time with a voicemail alert. I didn't listen to it. I couldn't. I knew what it would sound like. The familiar blend of concern layered over resignation. He wasn't the one who had lied, but he would be the one cleaning up after the fallout. The one nudged into the middle whether he wanted to be or not. I walked toward the window, watching students filter in and out of the houses across the street. Their lives seemed so distant from this storm brewing inside my own. For a moment, I wished adulthood didn't come with the kind of burdens that pulled your heart into two different loyalties. One to the people who raised you, and one to the person you've grown into without them. My phone buzzed again, but this time the alert was softer. A text, not a call. I opened it without thinking. Call your dad. He's worried. The message was short. No name attached. But I knew it was from my mom. Her texts always avoided punctuation, avoided emotion, avoided any acknowledgement that she might have contributed to the tension she wanted me to fix. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. She wasn't asking how I felt. She wasn't asking what had happened. She was asking me to step back into the role I always played. The mediator, the one who swallowed discomfort so the rest of them didn't have to face their own. I set the phone down again. A heaviness settled in my chest as I let myself consider something I rarely allowed space for: the imbalance in the way we functioned as a family. My dad tried to carry everything quietly. My mom redirected every conflict outward. And Kelsey, she floated above consequences, expecting the rest of us to absorb whatever fell. It wasn't resentment that washed over me in that moment. It was recognition. Recognition of a pattern so old I had mistaken it for normal. Standing there, I realized something had shifted inside me more deeply than I'd admitted. This wasn't about a party anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the quiet expectation that I would always bend first, always be the one to compromise, always be the one to repair what I didn't break. The phone stayed silent for a long while after that. I didn't know if my dad would call again. I didn't know if my mom was already rewriting the story in her mind to make sense of it in a way that required the least accountability. But I did know one thing with certainty. I couldn't keep participating in the same cycle. Not when it cost me parts of myself I wasn't willing to keep giving away. That thought settled over me slowly, like the first clear note in a song I'd been trying to hear for years. The next day unfolded with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made every sound feel sharper than it needed to be. I tried focusing on work, but concentration slipped through my fingers. I kept sensing something approaching, some inevitable confrontation drawing closer with each passing hour. It arrived in the late afternoon, though not in the form I expected. While walking back toward my building, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes cast downward in a way that made my breath catch. My dad, Robert Miller, had driven across town. He wasn't a man who showed up unannounced. Whenever he appeared somewhere in person, it meant whatever he needed to say couldn't be softened through a phone call. The sight of him there, waiting quietly, sent a ripple of conflicting emotions through me: dread, affection, exhaustion, and a trace of resignation. I approached slowly, bracing myself for the version of this conversation I'd been through too many times. He lifted his head when he heard my steps. There was no anger in his expression, only a kind of weary determination that made my stomach twist. We stood there for a moment, both aware of what the other already knew. No words were exchanged, none were needed. He gestured toward a small bench near the walking path, and we sat, the chilled air settling between us like a third presence. Inside my chest, something tightened. I didn't want him to speak first, because I already sensed the direction this might go. But he did, in the careful tone he reserved for difficult truths. I didn't interrupt him. I let his voice settle around me, even as each sentence chipped away at the fragile distance I'd tried to keep. He told me he'd spoken to my younger sister, Kelsey Miller, earlier that day. She had called him in tears, insisting she was being punished for something she never meant. According to her, the whole party had been a misunderstanding, something thrown together by friends. She told him I had turned cold without explanation. She hinted I was holding money over her head out of spite. Hearing that last part felt like a dull impact against my ribs. My dad didn't accuse me. He didn't demand a justification. Instead, he explained how confused he felt, caught again in the impossible middle ground between wanting to support me and wanting to protect the daughter who always seemed to need protecting. There was a heaviness in his words I couldn't ignore, a heaviness that made me realize he wasn't taking sides. He was drowning in the weight of trying to keep us from tearing further apart. For a moment, I almost slipped into the familiar role of comforting him, reassuring him, absorbing the discomfort for his sake. But something steadier rose up in me instead, the part of myself I had been slowly reclaiming over the past few days. I let the silence stretch, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Family loyalty shouldn't require self-betrayal. He went quiet eventually, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the pavement. Seeing him like that, torn, tired, pulled at a part of me I wished I didn't carry. I loved him. I always had. But loving him didn't mean sacrificing my boundaries to ease his discomfort. That was a lesson I had avoided learning for far too long. As we sat there, the wind picked up, brushing past us in short bursts. I felt its chill cut through my jacket, grounding me in the moment. A part of me wished that explaining everything would magically realign our family, that clarity would fix what had been broken for years. But clarity only works when both sides want to see the truth. And right now, I wasn't sure anyone besides me was ready to face it. My phone vibrated inside my pocket, and I took it out without thinking. A message blinked on the screen, a notification from my mom, Patricia Miller. I didn't open it. The preview alone was enough to feel the familiar pressure building. A few vague words urging unity, brushing past the impact of what had happened, nudging me toward forgiveness for the sake of appearances. I slipped the phone away and let out a slow breath. The pattern was unmistakable now. The more I stepped back, the more everyone expected me to step forward again. They weren't responding to the truth. They were responding to the disruption of the roles we'd been quietly assigned. I wasn't angry about that realization. I was tired, deeply tired of being the one who held everything together just because I knew how. Somewhere behind us, a car door slammed, startling a group of students walking by. Their laughter drifted into the air, carefree and unbothered. For a brief second, I envied them. Not their youth, but the simplicity of problems that didn't involve untangling years of emotional obligation. My dad exhaled next to me, a long, quiet breath that carried its own resignation. I didn't know what he expected me to say, or if he expected anything at all. All I knew was that whatever came next would demand a strength I wasn't sure I still possessed. Later that evening, a faint knock cut through the stillness in my apartment. It wasn't sharp or impatient. It was the kind of knock someone uses when they hope for a softer version of what's waiting on the other side. I froze for a moment, already sensing who it was before I even reached the door. When I opened it, my younger sister, Kelsey Miller, stood there, wrapped in a sweatshirt, hair pulled into a loose tie as if the weight of the day had worn her down. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the apartment as though she expected evidence of something she could argue against. I kept the door open just wide enough to show I wasn't shutting her out, but not wide enough to pretend everything was fine. The space between us felt tense, like a rope pulled too tight. She didn't ask to come in. Instead, she stood on the threshold with her shoulders drawn in, as if rehearsing an explanation she wasn't sure would land. I could feel the narrative already forming in her mind, one where she was misunderstood, one where intention outweighed impact, one where responsibility dissolved the moment someone else stepped in to fix the damage. But I didn't speak. I needed to hear what version of the story she had chosen to carry with her. Her expression wavered when she realized I wasn't rushing to fill the silence. Something in that quiet pressed her into discomfort she wasn't prepared for. And for the first time, I wasn't stepping in to make it easier. Standing there, I watched her shift her weight, avoiding my eyes each time her voice threatened to crack. I didn't prompt her. I didn't soften myself. I simply held the moment steady, letting her confront the space she had created between us. It was unsettling to see the sister I once tried to protect look everywhere but at me, as if eye contact alone might unravel the excuses she'd been holding on to. She finally drew in a breath that sounded like surrender and reached into her pocket. A phone emerged, her screen already open to a conversation thread. She didn't speak while scrolling, but the pace of her thumb revealed a growing desperation, the kind that comes from knowing a truth is about to expose more than just a mistake. When she handed me the screen, my chest tightened with an instinctive warning. I took the phone, and the glow illuminated the words that changed everything. It wasn't a single message. It was an entire group chat, with her friends chiming in, their names lined up beside laughing emojis and casual comments. And then another name appeared. My mom, Patricia Miller. Seeing it didn't shock me. The ease of the messages did. There it was, in plain text. Her telling them I would cover rent again, like always. My mom joking that I never check anything anyway, followed by her suggesting decor ideas for the very party I hadn't known existed. Friends encouraging the plan, celebrating it before it even happened, treating my savings like a resource they all had access to. My fingers tightened slightly as the words blurred together. Something sharp, cold, and quiet moved through me. Not rage, not heartbreak, but a recognition so clear it left no room for denial. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't miscommunication. This was intention. Deliberate, effortless intention. I handed the phone back to her, not because I didn't want to see more, but because I had already seen enough. The silence between us stretched into something heavy, and she seemed to shrink beneath it. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes finally meeting mine with a flicker of something close to fear, or maybe shame, the rare kind that appears only when the truth becomes impossible to outrun. Inside, my thoughts moved quietly, almost clinically. If family is the place where betrayal cuts deepest, then this was the moment I finally understood how deeply some wounds had been layered over the years. I wasn't surprised that she had involved her friends. What hit me harder was the ease with which our own mother had participated, using light humor to soften something she knew was wrong. A heaviness pressed behind my ribs, not bursting, just settling with the kind of weight that reshapes a person's resolve. The air in the doorway felt colder as the seconds passed, and I realized that whatever I felt for my sister, whatever loyalty I had carried for so long, was shifting into something firmer, something clearer than anger could ever be. Kelsey lowered her gaze, waiting for a reaction I didn't give. I held my expression steady, not from indifference, but from finally understanding a boundary I hadn't known I needed until now. And in that moment, the last traces of denial I had clung to slipped quietly out of reach. The door clicked shut behind Kelsey long after her footsteps had faded from the hallway, but the silence she left behind didn't feel empty. It felt intrusive, as if the weight of what I had just seen lingered in every corner of my apartment. I leaned against the wall and let the stillness settle over me, trying to absorb the full shape of the truth that had finally been laid bare. The group chat wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a window into how easily I had been discussed, planned around, and taken for granted. As the minutes passed, a dull ache pooled somewhere beneath my ribs. I found myself moving to the kitchen, not because I needed anything, but because the physical act of walking helped keep my thoughts from spiraling. I opened a cabinet, closed it again, rested my palms on the counter, and exhaled through the heaviness gathering in my chest. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing people you love have been using the parts of you meant to protect them, not exploit them. And that loneliness was settling in with startling clarity. My phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with a name I didn't expect. My cousin, Nina Vaughn. She rarely reached out unless something required sensitivity or discretion, and seeing her name gave me a moment of hesitation before I answered. I didn't speak right away. I just listened to her breath on the other end, steady and cautious in a way that told me she understood more than I realized. Her message was brief. She wanted me to know that whispers were already drifting through the extended family. Not about the party, not about the group chat. Those details hadn't reached them yet, but about the narrative Kelsey was spinning to protect herself. Nina didn't repeat every word. She didn't need to. I could hear the shape of the story in her voice, how I had supposedly overreacted, how I had turned cold, how I had made things harder than they needed to be. I thanked her quietly, more out of instinct than thought. When the call ended, the silence returned, but now it carried an edge. It wasn't disappointment or shock anymore. It was clarity. So much of my life had been spent smoothing problems, repairing fractures, stretching myself thin to hold together a structure that was already cracked long before I ever arrived to patch it. And every time I stepped in, I told myself it was kindness, but kindness becomes something else entirely when it is mined instead of shared. I walked into the living room and glanced at Logan's backpack beside the sofa. Bright, small, unassuming. The sight grounded me. That backpack held a future I cared about more than any obligation to the tangled expectations of adults who never learned to take responsibility for themselves. I couldn't allow him to grow up watching me absorb damage as if it were a normal part of family life. Children learn by observation, not instruction. And I needed him to see a version of me that understood boundaries, not one constantly crushed under guilt. The hours moved slowly after that. At one point, my phone buzzed again with a string of messages, none of which I opened. I didn't need to read them to know what they contained. There would be familiar tones, urgency disguised as concern, manipulation wrapped in half apologies, attempts to pull me back into the rhythm they preferred. The rhythm where I fixed what others broke and carried what others dropped. A quiet steadiness spread through me as I realized I didn't feel compelled to respond. Not out of spite, not to prove anything, but because I no longer recognized myself in the role they expected me to play. It was strange, almost peaceful, to let a boundary stand without constantly defending it. Sometime later, as dusk softened the edges of the room, I sat down on the arm of the couch and allowed myself a moment to breathe without interruption. No calls ringing through the apartment, no footsteps approaching the door. No immediate crisis demanding a reaction, just a rare stillness I hadn't felt in years. There is a moment in every breaking point where something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, as if your own mind finally aligns with the truth you've been avoiding. That moment settled into me now, cool and steady. I wasn't responsible for Kelsey's choices. I wasn't responsible for repairing the image she fractured. And I wasn't responsible for managing the discomfort others felt when the truth didn't fit the version they preferred. For the first time, the thought didn't feel harsh. It felt necessary. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt the faint edge of certainty taking root. Certainty that the path forward would demand distance, not negotiation. By the time the chaos around my sister stopped filling every corner of my day, a different kind of pressure settled in. I knew that if I didn't draw a clear line now, I would slide back into the patterns that had worn me down for years. One night, after my son was asleep, I sat at the table with my phone and opened the family group thread. The chat held birthdays, small talk, and, under all of it, the unspoken rule that I would step in whenever someone needed bailing out. I wrote one message. I said I would not be lending money, paying bills, delivering envelopes, or acting as anyone's financial backup anymore. I said I was responsible for my own home, and that everyone else needed to be responsible for theirs. Then I hit send. Nothing dramatic happened, but I felt a steady sense of alignment, like my actions had finally caught up to what I already knew was necessary. The replies came quickly. My mother sent long messages about how families are supposed to stick together and how life is expensive. She did not mention lies or parties. My sister followed with complaints about how hard things were, how abandoned she felt, how I had chosen a convenient moment to turn my back. She skimmed past her own choices like they were a detail that didn't count. Reading their words, I felt the old instinct to explain myself, to smooth it over, to prove I was not cruel. This time, I let the instinct pass. I set the phone down and left the messages unread for the rest of the night. Their disappointment belonged to them now. In the weeks that followed, pieces of information reached me through relatives. I heard that the landlord near campus had grown tired of excuses and late payments. Eventually, my sister had to leave the house she had been so eager to showcase online and move into a cheaper room farther out, without the crowd or the glitter she had tried to build her image on. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard that. I didn't want her to fail, but for the first time, the fallout from her decisions landed on her instead of on my savings. You cannot keep cushioning someone from impact and then be shocked when they never learn how to stand. Meanwhile, my mother tried to reassemble the old picture. She sent messages about holidays coming up, about how nice it would be all together again. Every invitation stepped around what had actually happened. The expectation was simple. I was supposed to let it go for the sake of appearances. My answers stayed short. I said I wanted stability for myself and for my son, and that I wasn't willing to sit in rooms where my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't re-argue anything, I just refused to show up on cue. Inside my own home, the absence of constant crisis made more of a difference than I expected. My phone stopped feeling like a trap door. I could plan my budget around our needs instead of other people's emergencies. When my son talked about his day, my attention stayed with him. We built new rhythms, simple meals we cooked together, a movie we watched because it made him laugh, walks where we talked about his plans instead of other people's mistakes. Looking back, I can see that the real shift wasn't in my sister or in my mother. It was in me. I stopped confusing being needed with being valued. I stopped calling self-erasure loyalty. I started treating my time, money, and peace of mind as things worth protecting. If there is a lesson here, it is that boundaries are not punishments. They mark where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Saying no did not mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped carrying what was never mine. My sister may never admit what she did. My mother may never look straight at her part in it. The story they tell other people may always sound softer than the truth. But I can live with that. In my home, my son is seeing something different. A version of family where love is not measured by how much damage you can absorb, and where helping someone does not mean funding their refusal to grow. I did not get a dramatic apology or a perfect reunion. I got distance, quiet, and a life that finally feels like it belongs to me.